When I was young, I viewed prayer as a way of pleading with God to give me things that I felt I needed, like courage, or for a certain unpleasant circumstance to leave me, like for bullies to leave me alone. I'd also pray, of course, for some of the sillier things that any young child will pray for, like wishing I was a robot, or that God would help me learn how to tie my shoes, or praying that God would help my cousin and I build a spacecraft out of wood that would help us fly to the moon. Sooner or later, though, every Christian learns that intercessory prayer doesn't always work. For example, often you'll pray for something to happen and it won't happen. Sometimes it happens later, sometimes it happens way later, and sometimes it never happens at all. Often, in my own life, I found that the likeliness of a prayer request coming true seemed to be directly proportional to the likeliness of it happening without me praying. To adjust for this, as I got older, I started to ask for things I was more likely to get. For example, instead of asking for God to make me a robot, give me superpowers, or send me to the moon, I'd ask for God's help on homework, help on dealing with a certain emotion, help for a friend in difficult circumstances. These are all things that I realized were likely to happen anyway, but I thought asking God for help might tip the odds in my favor. And I also feared sometimes that if I didn't ask for them, that God wouldn't let them happen, despite the fact that they seemed likely. Often I'd been burned by the situation of thinking that some good thing was definitely going to happen to me, only to be later disappointed that it didn't happen. And if I hadn't prayed, I would sometimes think it was my lack of prayer that caused it not to happen. However, eventually, even this type of intercessory prayer seemed all but obsolete to me, due to one creeping realization about God's nature: His omniscience. If God already knew everything before it happened, and had set all of the possible events in the universe in place, there was absolutely nothing I could ask for that He didn't already know about. Further, if He was omniscient, all benevolent, and had a plan for me, then why on earth was I trying to put myself in the driver's seat? What I really needed to be doing was trying to discover His will for my life. If God was omniscient, then He had already given me all the tools I needed to solve whatever problem I had. It was my responsibility to find those tools and His will for how He wanted me to use them. Not for me to tell Him what tools I needed and how I thought I should use them. So in this realization, I all but dismissed the idea of intercessory prayer. I submitted as much as was mentally and physically possible to the pursuit of discovering and executing what I felt was God's will. Prayer's sole purpose for me became discovering what God's will was and connecting with God personally and emotionally as a divine Father and friend. In terms of my conception of God, this had the effect of moving the weight of my belief in God away from intercessory prayer and towards my personal experience and relationship with God. One thing I want you to notice is that this entire transformation happened completely within my Christian worldview. This is an important point because it highlights how my eventual transformation to atheism took years, and that during much of the time that it was happening, I wasn't even aware it was happening. From my perspective, I was just building up knowledge, following the truth, and learning about the world as any good student or effective servant of God should. I never thought that anything I was learning or thinking would eventually lead to me doubting the existence of God. As an atheist, I later discovered an in-depth study on intercessory prayer, involving 1,800 patients undergoing heart surgery. The study found no positive effect on the patients who had been prayed for. Even as an atheist, the results surprised me. Despite my own personal resolution as a Christian to use prayer solely for finding God's will, I did suspect that intercessory prayer had a positive effect, at least psychologically, just to know someone was praying for you, regardless of whether their prayers actually had some kind of metaphysical power. Surprisingly, the study found that people who knew they were being prayed for actually had more complications after surgery than those who didn't. Before I came to my realizations about God's omniscience, I was persuaded by an argument for the validity of prayer in the form of how God answers prayer. It's often said that God answers prayers in the form of yes, no, and wait. Sometimes the hardest answer to accept is wait. In their brilliant, if somewhat condescending video, GII Video demonstrates, using a clever example, how this entire heuristic can be entirely psychological, without God actually answering any prayers. To do this, they present the hypothetical in which, instead of praying to God, you pray to a jug of milk. The jug of milk answers prayers in the form of yes, no, and wait. Assume that you pray to the jug of milk to give you $1,000, and they ask you to wait and see what happens. They present 3 different scenarios. In the first scenario, out of the blue, you get a check for $1,100 from the IRS, and they say, "See, the jug of milk answered your prayer." In the second scenario, 7 weeks later, out of the blue, you get a cost of living raise, and it happens to increase your salary by $1,200. And they say, "See, the jug of milk answered your prayer. You just had to wait." In the third scenario, nothing happens for 6 months. And if you ask them why, they say, "We have to trust that the jug of milk knows best. Let's be patient." It's clear how all 3 of these scenarios can be applied to a prayer to God, to a prayer to a jug of milk, to a prayer to anything. Unfortunately, as comforting as the yes, no, and wait heuristic is, it can work without anything actually answering your prayers. But I want to re-emphasize that it was my own respect for God's sovereignty over my life that caused me, personally, to abandon the practice of intercessory prayer.